No better way to start a wine tasting weekend on the Mornington Peninsula than with a good dinner on Friday evening. Chris had booked us into the Italian restaurant Del Posto in Sorrento, which was packed with visibly and audibly happy diners. Most of our foursome selected the same antipasto, which could also have been a primo. The crespelle, with swimmer crab, spinach, ricotta, and thyme. I instantly knew Chris had made a good restaurant choice. But that I had expected already. There are those who think you can't improve on classics. And then there are people like me who think you certainly can equal the original, as long as you come up with a great variation. In this case, for my primo main dish, that meant duck lasagne with homemade truffle oil. I would have no problem if this were able to be my go-to lasagne. Chris and Howard were doing the wine selections, and after an opening Etna Bianco made from 100% Caricante grapes, not filmed, we moved on to a red from the Tenuta San Leonardo, right at the border between Trentino and the Veneto, between Monte Baldo and the Monte Lassini. Our Terre di San Leonardo was described as a classic Bordeaux mix, but this particular year seemed to have 10% Carmenère along with the Cabernet and Merlot. Whatever its compositional appellation, we were delighted with it. There had to be room for dessert afterwards, and again the majority went with a limoncello crème brûlée. Altogether a very auspicious beginning to our peninsula weekend. If planning and organization were Olympic disciplines, both Chris and Howard would be multiple gold medalists. And Chris had meticulously devised our Saturday's wine tasting program, ensuring that the itinerary was both manageable and going to be relaxed at the same time. He also thought I needed to see a bit of beach before we started our winery tour. So we drove over to Sorrento Back Beach to have a quick look at the surf. Back Beach meaning facing the ocean, as opposed to Front Beach, which faces onto Port Phillip Bay. If my calculations are accurate, the ocean is less than 3 kilometers from the bay at this end of the peninsula. It was too early in the season for the Sorrento Surf Life-Saving Club to be manned, so visitors were left to observe and heed the various warning signs. It was also far too chilly for any sunbathers to be about, and too windy for any lingering. So after a brief walk on the beach, we got back into the car and headed over to our first tasting stop, the Ocean 8 Winery. As neither Howard nor I were going to be doing any driving, we did the lion's share of the wine tasting. At Ocean 8, I remember outstanding Pinot Gris and Chardonnays. At Merrick's General Wine Store, in addition to Pinot Gris and Chardonnay, we also tasted a Beaulieu Rosé and a Pinot Noir. A quick vote on lunchtime options yielded a unanimous choice to get some toasted ham and cheese sandwiches to take away before we continued on to our next stop. That was due east of Merrick's, in a slightly flatter area of the peninsula, the Quealy Winery. We ended up spending more time than we'd expected here, as the Pinot Grigios and Friulanos, the latter having been pioneered in Australia by Quealy, as well as the Pinot Noirs, were just too good for us not to taste all the wines being poured. I also remember an unusual white cuvée called Pobble Blanc, made from Pinot Grigio, Friulano, Moscato Giallo, Riesling, and Chardonnay. And there was an equally untypical red cuvée called Rageous, made from Pinot Noir with Shiraz and Sangiovese. I took a look in the barrel storage area in the back, where the obvious, if unofficial, boss of Quealy came down a stairway to greet me and make sure I cut the mustard as a visitor to the property. If I'm being perfectly honest, I wasn't sure exactly what sort of cuvée this cat was. Chris had a few more stops planned for us, so the wines being bought were packed into the car and we proceeded. You may need to be reminded that I was not driving. Our last wine stop was the Main Ridge Winery, the first winemakers to operate commercially on the Mornington Peninsula. Here I remember tasting exceptional Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs. There was another tasting on the agenda, the last of the day. It wasn't devoted to wine, however. We drove back east to Red Hill, where we parked at Bass and Flinders Distillery, famed for its gins. On that day, there were 2 different tasting flights of the distillery's gins. My choice included the Soft and Smooth, whose mixture of botanicals was more traditional than the others I tasted. I thought it was excellent, and the one I would probably want to turn to most frequently for a G&T. The Wild and Spicy Gin 10 lived up to its name, with native pepperberry being the botanical one would be least likely to encounter outside of Australia. And lastly, I enjoyed the Monsoon Gin, which earns its Eastern Twist subtitle from ginger, lemongrass, and ginseng. Howard's flight of more unusual gins also had this one, but included the house's truffle gin, infused with local truffles grown on the Mornington Peninsula, which was very predictably distinctive while requiring a liking for truffle aromas in the unlikeliest liquids. His flight also included the Angry Ant Gin, whose botanicals you won't find anywhere else. Numbers of Australian flowers, herbs, and nuts, and, lest you think the name is merely playful alliteration, pheromones released by Australian ants. Definitely worth tasting, and worth buying for your most adventurous or most skeptical, spirit-loving guests. Chris's planning came with the immense discipline of alternating himself and Elle as designated drivers so that Howard and I could taste to our liver's content. I can't recall who drove the last stretch as we headed back to Sorrento. We stopped at Murray's Lookout to savor the fresh air and the great view out north to Port Phillip Bay before the last few kilometers back to the house. Our Peninsula Saturday finished up in appropriate style, with Chris displaying his consummate barbecue mastery. But that was a private show just for the 4 of us, not for my vlog viewers. My next episode will see me back in Melbourne for dinner with another creative take on a familiar cuisine. All those details in my next video.